Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. Today we're going to be looking at the media that predicted the future, Iceberg. I thought I'd take a break from the J-horror Iceberg this week and do something a little lighter. I randomly stumbled upon this Iceberg chart, and while there were some classic entries we've all probably seen floating around the internet, there are a lot on here that I'd never heard of, and to me that's always a great marker for a good Iceberg chart. Just a disclaimer here, don't take this one too seriously. While a lot of these are flat out predictions about the future that are pretty accurate, there are a lot of entries here that are just eerie or interesting coincidences, and some that are straight up jokes. Now I will go into possible explanations for some of these, but for the most part, I found it more fun to put on my tinfoil hat and just go with it, and I hope you will too. The Iceberg was created by Pen and Hex Studios, so shout out to them. I'll leave a link to the chart below, but why don't we just dive into it? This is the media that predicted the future, Iceberg explained. So let's get into tier 1, starting with The Simpsons predicts Trump's presidency. It's no secret that The Simpsons has gotten several things right over the years, and probably the most notable comes from the episode Bart to the Future. In this episode, we go 30 years into the future of the Simpsons family, with Lisa becoming the first female president. In a scene in the Oval Office, Lisa mentions that the country has racked up quite a bit of debt thanks to President Trump.
As you know, we've inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump.
This episode aired in 2000, 16 years before Trump became the actual president of the United States. A couple of notes on this one. Firstly, this joke didn't just come out of nowhere. Many people forget that Trump actually did announce a run for presidency in 1999 as an independent, and eventually dropping out of the race. In light of this happening, it kind of makes the joke seem a little more in line with politics at the moment. Secondly, there was an episode of The Simpsons titled A Trumptastic Voyage that was released during the 2016 election and had several scenes parodying real life, like Trump descending on the escalator, for instance. When people talk about the Bart to the Future episode, they often show stills from this episode, and because of that, there's been a mass conflation of the two, leading people to think that the parody sequences in Trumptastic Voyage were crazy accurate predictions. But either way, the actual prediction is pretty interesting, and this is not the only time the Simpsons have been that accurate. Simpsons 9/11 magazine. If you've been on the internet any time in the last decade, you've likely seen at least this image of Bart holding a magazine that supposedly predicted 9/11 3 years before the event. In episode 9 of season 1, the Simpsons plan a trip to New York and Bart holds up a magazine. The magazine shows the skyline of New York and has an advertisement for a $9 bus ticket into the city. The 9 is eerily placed next to the two towers and looks a lot like 9/11. A little spooky, I gotta admit, and you know, most people don't talk about the other weird things in this episode. Now, as the old saying goes, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So people have dissected this episode to death, showing all kinds of things apparently related to the event. But I'll just point out a couple of the more interesting ones because we can't stick on this all day. In the background of one scene, there's a billboard with a plane on it, and it's strangely pointed up at an angle seemingly towards the city skyscrapers. In one of the final scenes in the episode, the family drives back home and we see the New York skyline behind them, only there's no World Trade Center. The towers are completely missing. Yeah, so if you get caught up in the conspiracy, there's a lot of weird connections you can find. Looney Tunes cartoon predicts 9/11. Speaking of 9/11 predictions, there are a lot in this iceberg. One of the creepiest supposed predictions comes from an old Looney Tunes theatrical episode titled Often an Orphan. The episode follows Charlie the dog as he attempts to find a new owner, focusing his attempts on Porky Pig. In a strange sequence, when Porky refuses the dog, Charlie goes on a pleading spiel about how he'll have to return to the city, seemingly reliving horrifying events, culminating in him shouting, "The towers are falling."
Look out for that truck! Honk, honk! Look out for that taxi! Boing! Beep, beep! Honk, honk! Beep, beep! Honk! What's that? Look! It's the towers! They're falling!
With the mindset that this is about 9/11, it is pretty disturbing. I remember finding this video late at night as a kid, and what can I say, it actually did creep me out. Many people have pointed out that the dog is simply describing the noisiness of a big city, which explains everything. Except for the towers part. I mean, you can't deny that. That is weird. Metal Gear Rising Revengeance predicted the Trump slogan. This is just a fun one. So the villain in Metal Gear Rising Revengeance is a US Senator named Stephen Armstrong who has a grand vision of turning the US into a social Darwinist system where the strong survive and the weak are cold, effectively dismantling the current political and social systems. That's kind of all unnecessary, but I wanted to give you some insight into one of the most hilarious and some might say best over-the-top villains in gaming history. He's infused with nanotech tech giving him superhuman abilities, and he pilots a giant mech, all while wearing a tie. It's a lot of fun, and that's all just to say that at one point during a lengthy and over-the-top monologue, Armstrong drops this little number that sounds awfully familiar.
They'll make America great again!
I like to think that the game didn't predict Trump's slogan, but rather Trump is actually a hardcore Kojima fan and stole it from Armstrong. Just as a side note, many people forget that Ronald Reagan had a similar slogan during his presidential campaign, and some have said that Armstrong was possibly referencing that. Demolition Man predicts COVID-19. Demolition Man is one of my favorite sci-fi action movies. The story takes place in the year 2030 when a cryogenically frozen criminal is unthawed and begins causing chaos in a crime-free future. So they also bring back Sylvester Stallone, a super cop who was also frozen, in order to stop the criminal. Well, that's the gist of it anyway. The movie actually got several predictions right, such as Zoom calls becoming prominent and bite-sized media. But the big prediction was that of a global pandemic that heavily affects the world. The virus in the film is called the Arnold Schwarzenegger Presidential Library Virus, or simply the Schwarzenegger virus for short. Clearly a knock on Sylvester Stallone's infamous action star rival. Well, the effects of the Schwarzenegger virus parallels the coronavirus in a few ways, like physical contact being prohibited in most instances, including the banning of handshakes. Also, the restaurant industry has taken a huge hit in the future, with many closing down due to the effects of the virus. Speaking of restaurants, another prediction was the Taco Bell logo in the movie, which had a more minimalist white and purple design. Yeah, it looks pretty similar to the modern logo that only changed in 2016. South Park predicts Beyond Fried Chicken. This is referring to the South Park episode Doubling Down, where Cartman's girlfriend Heidi suggests they go on a vegan diet together. So in one scene, Cartman just writes the word Beyond on a bucket of KFC and tells her that it's their new vegan option of plant-based chicken. This episode aired in 2017, and little did we know that 5 years later, KFC would actually make Beyond Fried Chicken. Yeah, it's the exact same name as the South Park episode. Pretty funny. Back to the Future 2 predicts Cubs winning the World Series. This is one of the all-time classics. Back to the Future 2 has one of the most well-known visions of the future, and there have been many comparisons to the real-life 2015 in which the movie took place, such as video calls, use of drones, electronic payments, and more comical ones like Jaws 19 predicting ridiculous numbered movie sequels. But the most famous prediction would be that the Cubs would win the World Series in 2015. Well, they were pretty damn close. The Cubs actually did win the World Series in 2016, but they hadn't won in 108 years up to that point. So the fact that they were even in the ballpark, no pun intended, is insane. The Simpsons predicts Disney buying 20th Century Fox. Yet another Simpsons prediction: in the 1998 episode When You Dish Upon a Star, there's a shot of the Fox studio lot which has the 20th Century Fox logo. And if you look closely, you'll see the words "a division of Walt Disney Company." Such a small detail for people to notice, but still pretty cool to have guessed that one 20 years before. Megamind predicted Queen Elizabeth's death. While a lot of these are goofy, this one is just a straight up joke. It's basically just the scene in Megamind when Titan says,
"There is no Easter Bunny, there is no Tooth Fairy, and there is no Queen of England."
Well, it's kind of a prediction. I mean, there is no Queen of England now, technically. Anyway, moving on. Sharknado predicted Hurricane Ian. So as far as I can gather, this is referring to a video in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian of a real-life shark swimming in a flooded Florida neighborhood. So it does seem like this shark was carried out of the ocean by the hurricane, which spawned a ton of Sharknado jokes. Moving into Tier 2, starting with Three-Eyed Fish is Real. This is yet another Simpsons prediction. There's a fairly recognizable three-eyed fish shown in several episodes. The fish lives in bodies of water near the nuclear power plant and is clearly a product of nuclear radiation. So in 2023, a story came out where a fisherman had in fact caught a three-eyed mutated fish in a reservoir outside of a power plant. It's unclear whether this was for sure due to the power plant, but it's still pretty interesting. Deus Ex predicted the 9/11 attack. So Deus Ex is a fan favorite first-person RPG that was released in 2000. The story, however, took place in 2052 New York City, a setting that has now become infamous because the city's skyline noticeably lacks the World Trade Center. This was actually due to memory limitations, and there is an in-game explanation as to why they're missing. They were taken down by a terrorist attack. Pretty eerie, and as I said, this game released a year before the actual event. Deus Ex predicted a pandemic. The future world of Deus Ex was also hit by a major virus that caused a global pandemic. The Grey Death, as it's called in the game, was created by a research lab in Hong Kong, although this was covered up and the Grey Death was pushed as a natural phenomenon. Eventually, a temporary vaccine is created by the same corporation that funded the Grey Death itself and is used as a way to control the public. As you can see, there are some elements here that would raise the eyebrows of any conspiracy theorist. Metal Gear Solid 2 predicted fake news. This one really sent me down a rabbit hole. Unlike many on this list that seem like fun coincidences, this one took me by surprise as being fairly profound. The Metal Gear franchise has one of the most convoluted storylines in gaming and can be pretty intimidating to a new player for that reason. But for the sake of this entry, I don't think it matters whether you know much about the series. You've probably seen the codec conversation screen, which is a staple of the games, in which characters communicate with each other, especially since there have been a ton of memes using this format. Well, it's actually the final codec conversation of Metal Gear Solid 2 that's the focus of this entry. In a huge plot twist, the protagonist Raiden discovers that his supposed commander, Colonel Roy Campbell, is actually an artificial intelligence manipulating him.
Who are you?
To begin with, we're not what you'd call human.
This AI discusses its goals to control the spread of information to ostensibly preserve American values while paradoxically proposing censorship to combat misinformation and bias. The AI's conversation seems to anticipate modern issues related to the digital age, such as the overwhelming flood of information on the internet, the challenge of discerning valuable content, and the polarization of political and social discourse.
And accumulate in the sandbox of political correctness and value systems.
Everyone withdraws into their own small gated community, afraid of a larger forum. They stay inside their little ponds, leaking whatever truth suits them into the growing cesspool of society at large.
In this way, Metal Gear Solid 2 somehow foresaw the complications of an era where information is unfiltered and rampant, leading to confusion, misinformation, and the entrenchment of biases. If you're in the right mindset, this conversation is really eerie, and it doesn't help that the AI colonel's face keeps morphing into this creepy form. YouTuber Max Darrett put the spotlight on this moment in his two-part video, The Most Profound Moment in Gaming History, and it's a fascinating watch. Planet of the Apes trilogy predicts COVID-19. This is referring to the virus that wipes out most of humanity in the Planet of the Apes trilogy. It's a little bit of a stretch, but the connection is that the virus did essentially come from a lab leak and spread rapidly across the globe, exacerbated by modern travel and the interconnectedness of societies. Like I said, it's kind of a stretch because pandemics are a sci-fi cliche and have been for years, so of course it's hard not to make the connection to the real-life pandemic. But I won't lie, I was rewatching these movies recently, and the start of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is literally news coverage of a global pandemic as we see a global map and the virus spreading, and it's pretty unsettling how close the news footage mirrors what we saw in real life. Ed, and Eddie predicts NFTs. This is a little bit of a goof, but in the Ed, and Eddie episode Quick Shot Ed, there's a scene where Eddie proclaims there's gotta be a way of turning pictures into profit when he suddenly sees an image of an ape.
Nah, there's gotta be a way of turning pictures into profit. Huh? Hey, I just stepped into my best idea yet!
In this context, you can't help but make connections to the Bored Ape NFT. VeggieTales predicts modern humor. This one's great. Well, if you're unfamiliar or didn't happen to grow up in a Christian household in the early 2000s, VeggieTales was a computer-generated Christian kids show usually teaching moral and biblical lessons using anthropomorphic vegetables with a comedic spin. In one particular episode, the show's hosts, Bob and Larry, have a conversation about comedy of the future.
In the future, entertainment will be randomly generated.
Randomly generated?
Randomly generated.
As the scene progresses, it becomes more and more spot on with AI-generated jokes, anti-humor, and a focus on absurdism and randomness, perfectly capturing the current state of internet humor.
I don't know. Why did the chicken cross the road? Weed eater.
Now that's funny.
Futurama predicts suicide pods. Well, this one is dark. In the very first episode of Futurama, Fry attempts to enter what he thinks is a phone booth, but it turns out to be a pod that you can pay to take your life. It's actually how he meets Bender, who's about to off himself. Well, the idea of a suicide pod in the future is obviously absurd, which is why it's funny, but guess what? Some Australian dude named Philip Nishke actually made a real-life suicide pod, which he calls a sarcopod, that helps someone euthanize themselves. Bizarre. I do wonder if he'll upgrade it eventually to have the slow and painful option.
Please select mode of death, quick and painless, or slow and horrible.
Family Guy predicts Caitlyn Jenner. This is referring to a joke in Family Guy where Stewie informs Brian that Bruce Jenner is actually a woman.
Bruce Jenner is a man.
No, Brian. That's what the press would have you believe, but he's not. Bruce Jenner is a woman.
Followed by Jenner doing a full-on feminine dance routine in front of some sailors. Apparently the show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, talked about predictions like this one and mentioned that oftentimes the writers would pitch jokes related to the Hollywood rumor mill, and apparently the idea that Jenner was trans was a rumor in Hollywood long before it actually happened in the mainstream.
An elegant, beautiful Dutch woman.
South Park predicts Miley Cyrus's downfall. The South Park episode Britney's New Look was focused on celebrity worship and more specifically, the obsession with watching famous people crash and burn for entertainment. Most of the episode focuses on Britney Spears, but the episode ends with the news doing a story on Miley Cyrus, the 15-year-old superstar, and the South Park residents awaiting her inevitable downfall for their entertainment.
Hannah Montana's Miley Cyrus, though only 15 years old, is already on her way to being a major superstar. Looks like next harvest will be even better.
Kratos!
Pretty funny, the idea that they call her the next harvest and imply that these celebrities are used as a sort of social sacrifice, like something from H.P. Lovecraft. Johnny Bravo predicts 9/11. This is referring to an episode of Johnny Bravo where Johnny and his friend argue outside of a movie theater, and behind them is a poster of a tower on fire and the words "coming soon." I'm all for the fun of this, but come on, this one's a major stretch considering the amount of action films that have exploding buildings. Of course, they might make a fake movie poster with that concept, and it's not like there's two buildings or a plane or anything, it's just a building on fire.
For your information, it was rich in symbolism.
Biggie's Juicy predicted 9/11. This is referring to a Biggie lyric where he seemingly mentions the World Trade Center blowing up. The thing is, this seems to be a reference to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, an event that was overshadowed by the later attacks. Diary of a Wimpy Kid predicted NFTs. This is yet another NFT gag. There's a scene in one of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books where Greg pays for an expensive dinner using a drawing, implying that he's using the piece of art as currency. Video Game Donkey predicts Kanye sampling the Glob Glow Gab Glab. It took me a minute to get to the bottom of this one, but it's kind of insane. So you might know Video Game Donkey as he's probably one of the most popular gamers on YouTube. While he mainly focuses on gaming content, he's been known to dabble in other areas. Well, back in August of 2021, in anticipation of Kanye West's new album Donda, Donkey did a live stream where he told viewers he received the entire album ahead of time. This was obviously a joke and became apparent when he started playing the tracks, which were all gags such as I Am the Glob Glow Gab Glab, a song from the bizarre animated movie Straczynski and the Animated House, which became a huge meme years ago. So a couple weeks later, Kanye held a listening party for the album, and to everyone's shock, I Am the Glob Glow Gab Glab was in fact featured as a sample in one of the songs. So yeah, one of the most wild predictions on the Iceberg. Many people have pointed out that this couldn't have been a coincidence and that Kanye must have seen the stream. But in a way, that's even more shocking, that one of the most famous artists in the world, at least at the time, is somehow a Donkey fan. Either way, this one's crazy. Alright, let's move into Tier 3. Starting with Legends of Chamberlain Heights predicts Kobe Bryant's death. In an episode of Legends of Chamberlain Heights that aired in 2016, a scene depicts Kobe Bryant's helicopter crashing to the ground and then exploding with him in it. Pretty chilling considering this was of course 4 years before Kobe's actual death, but the episode has since been banned from airing ever since because some people saw reruns of the episode shortly after Kobe's death and assumed it was actually mocking him. Gadget's niece invented the iPad before Steve Jobs. So in the original animated show Inspector Gadget, one of the prominent characters was Gadget's niece, Penny, who was actually a genius inventor. While most of the gadgets we see in the show are over-the-top contraptions that have no basis in reality, one device did actually come pretty close to a real-life invention, the iPad. Penny had a device she called her computer book, a device that had video chatting, a vast database for information retrieval, a colorful display, and even a USB port. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but for a show that was released over 40 years ago, it wasn't too far off. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon predicted Russia invading Georgia. Although released in 2001, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon takes place in 2008 during a fictional Russian invasion of Georgia. Oddly enough, Russia did in fact invade Georgia, and even weirder, it did happen in 2008. Lone Gunman Pilot predicts 9/11. This is a weird one. Lone Gunman was an action thriller TV show that only aired for one season back in 2001. Well, let me explain the very first episode of the show. Rogue members of the US government remotely hijack an airliner flying to Boston, planning to crash it into the World Trade Center.
Corner of Liberty and Washington, Lower Manhattan.
World Trade Center.
going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
Not only that, but the plan is to let anti-American terrorist groups take credit for the attack in order to gain support for a profitable new war. Yeah, definitely sounds like a couple of conspiracies I've heard. As I mentioned, this episode aired in March of 2001, exactly 6 months before September 11th. The Simpsons predict Siegfried and Roy getting attacked by a tiger. In this Simpsons episode, two Vegas performers, who are clearly a parody of Siegfried and Roy, the famous magicians, are attacked by the performing white tiger. This episode aired 10 years before the real-life attack of Roy by his white tiger. South Park predicts the death of Osama bin Laden. In the episode It's a Jersey Thing, South Park is being taken over by the cast of Jersey Shore. Eventually, Osama bin Laden comes to the rescue and helps thwart the invading Jersey forces, and the episode ends with Osama being shot in the head by a Special Forces commando. 1 year later, he was in fact shot in the head by SEAL Team 6. Simpsons predict the Higgs boson. This one always kind of blows my mind. Apparently, an episode of The Simpsons from 1998 titled The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace contains a mathematical equation devised by Homer Simpson that closely predicts the mass of the Higgs boson particle, over a decade before it was actually discovered by scientists at CERN in 2012. It's no secret that many of the Simpsons writers are highly intelligent mathematicians, and this is a great example of some of that brilliance slipping into the show. Party Music album art predicted 9/11. This one is really crazy. So, The Coup were a hip-hop group in the late 90s and early 2000s. Well, in June 2001, the group released the cover art for their upcoming album, Party Music, and the art is pretty shocking. It's the two artists standing in front of the World Trade Center, which is exploding behind them. The album was supposed to release in early September 2001 and was of course pushed back following the attacks, as well as a change in the album's artwork. I can't imagine how the actual artist who designed the cover must have felt when the disaster happened. He probably felt like Isaac Mendez from Heroes. Okay, that's a deep cut. Die Hard box art. This is referring to the Die Hard NES game box art, which featured Nakatomi Plaza from the movie set ablaze. The thing is, the angle that the building is at and pressed into a flat image, it kind of looks like the two towers are on fire. Not really a prediction, but just unfortunate choice in art. Godzilla vs. Megalon poster. Speaking of unfortunate art choices, this was the original poster for the American version of Godzilla vs. Megalon. I guess they wanted to show the creatures in a familiar American setting, even though a fight atop the World Trade Center doesn't exist at all in the actual film. Weird to see. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure loosely predicts 9/11. This is referring to an image in the manga JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which shows a man having been impaled on a telephone pole wearing a t-shirt that seemingly says 9/11 on it, and a plane flying in the background. It was released 10 years before 9/11, and it's a pretty loose comparison, but still interesting. Homefront predicted the death of Kim Jong-il. Homefront is a first-person military shooter that released in 2011 and takes place in a 2027 dystopian United States where a reunified Korea has invaded most of the country. The catalyst for all these events was the death of Kim Jong-il, which the game placed in early 2012. This is only mere weeks apart from the real-life death of Kim Jong-il, making it a weirdly accurate prediction. I Am Legend predicts Batman vs. Superman. This is one of those entries that I remember seeing back in the day and assumed it was photoshopped or something. But no, it's not photoshopped. There's a billboard in I Am Legend promoting a Batman v Superman movie. Of course, this film was released in 2007, nearly a decade before we got such a film. Well, the story behind this is that the producer and writer of I Am Legend, Akiva Goldsman, had actually written an early draft of a Batman Superman movie at the time, but it was dropped early on. So he wanted to put the image in as an homage to his unmade film. Pretty interesting, and the most standout thing to me about this is how similar the logo in I Am Legend and some of the promotional images for the actual movie are. Gravity Falls predicted Doki Doki Literature Club. The Gravity Falls episode, Seuss and the Real Girl, features a sentient animatronic character named Giffany who falls in love with Seuss. When Seuss tries to return the game, Giffany becomes jealous and tries to harm him and his potential love interests. Doki Doki Literature Club is a dating sim turned psychological thriller that shares many of these same themes. It presents sentient characters within a dating sim, most notably Monica, who becomes self-aware and manipulates the game's code to eliminate her competition for the player's affection. Both Giffany and Monica exhibit the ability to break the fourth wall, acknowledging their existence within a game and interacting with the player/viewer on a meta level. This one is more just fun similarities, but I like both of these, so I had to mention it. Ponyo predicted 2011 tsunami in Japan. Ponyo's a 2008 film about a fish girl escaping from her father to go on land. A large part of the film centers around a huge tsunami destroying much of a Japanese coastal city, which is caused by Ponyo's escape. A few years later, a tsunami did in fact destroy large parts of Japan, and the film was banned from airing on television shortly after. Garfunkel and Oates predicted Kanye's downfall. Garfunkel and Oates is a comedy duo who rose to internet fame primarily due to their comedic songs, which were exactly what YouTube was looking for circa 2010. Well, this particular entry comes from the part of their stage show in a game they called Who Said It, Hitler or Kanye, in which they read quotes from both figures and had the audience guess who the quote belonged to.
I stand here as a revolutionary. It is as a revolutionary against the revolution.
And it ends up being a harder game than you'd think. This, of course, in hindsight, seemed to be an eerie foreshadowing of Ye's hard stances in recent years. Come Together predicts John Lennon's death. This is referring to the opening part of Come Together, where John Lennon repeatedly whispers, "Shoot me." And this repeats throughout the song. The implication is that he predicted his own death when he was shot down in 1980, I guess. I don't know. Lilo and Stitch deleted scene loosely predicts 9/11. This is referring to a scene in Lilo and Stitch where Stitch hijacks an airplane to chase Gontu through a city, narrowly avoiding skyscrapers. After the 9/11 attack, this scene was significantly altered. Nothing too special here. Matrix loosely predicts 9/11. This is loose indeed, but it's an interesting bit of trivia. In The Matrix, released in 1999, there's a classic scene where Agent Smith interrogates Neo. While he looks through his files, you can spot several details, one being that Neo's passport just so happens to expire on September 11th, 2001. Like I said, if anything, it's an interesting bit of trivia. All right, we're already on to tier 4, starting with South Park predicts Jared Fogle being a pedophile. This is in reference to the fact that in the classic South Park episode with Jared Fogle, there are several jokes aimed at Fogle being into kids.
I'm gonna seek out all the underprivileged and hungry children of the world, and I'm going to give them AIDS myself.
Of course, this was 15 years before Fogle went to jail on charges of sex with minors and possession of CP. Yikes. It's worth noting that Fogle appears again in the South Park game Fractured But Whole, and this time he's really out to get the kids. Hilariously disturbing. The Simpsons predict Bengt Holmstrom winning the Nobel Prize. Here's yet another Simpsons prediction. It's funny how many of these predictions came from adult animated shows. Anyway, in 2010, an episode of The Simpsons shows some of the nerdier kids, including Lisa and Milhouse, staying up to watch the announcement for the Nobel Prizes. At one point, one of the kids reveals a betting pool for who they think would win the different categories. Well, on this chart, made up of real-life economists, scientists, and writers, you can see that Milhouse put his vote in for economist Bengt Holmstrom. Holmstrom went on 6 years later to in fact win the Nobel Prize in economics. Damn, they did it again. The Wreck of the Titan predicts the sinking of the Titanic. This one is really great. So Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, is a novella originally published in 1898. It describes the sinking of a great ship, the Titan, in the Atlantic after hitting an iceberg. Sound familiar? Yeah, obviously the Titanic comes to mind. Well, this book was written 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic, but the similarities are uncanny. The ships were both supposed to be huge and unsinkable. Not only did both ships crash into an iceberg in the Atlantic, but the crashes take place in the same month of April. There's even a few smaller details that are similar, like the fact that the ships both had a shortage of life rafts. And I mean, come on, even the names are so similar, it's crazy. Spaceballs predicted canned air. Remember that great scene in Spaceballs when President Screw pulls some canned air out of his desk and cracks it open like a cold beer or something? We all laughed because it was funny. It's air. Who would actually buy that? Well, the future is bizarre, my friends, and you can in fact buy canned air. Not as a joke or a gag either. There's a company called Vitality Air that is making hundreds of thousands of dollars selling it. Absolutely wild. Dream Theater's Metropolis 2000 Scenes from New York original album art. So this album literally released on September 11th, 2001, and its album art featured the New York skyline in flames, most prominently the Twin Towers. Of course, they immediately reissued it with a different cover, but it's still a little weird that it was released on the exact day. I'll give it that. Family Guy predicted the downfall of Miley Cyrus. I think this is referring to the Family Guy episode where Miley Cyrus has a complete meltdown and reveals she's a robot. Not quite as on point as the South Park one, but I guess the verdict is still out on the robot thing. Spy Kids predicted Apple Watch. This one's more of a joke, but Junie from Spy Kids had a futuristic watch that could do do all kinds of things from his wrist. But I think this entry is more in reference to the ongoing meme that people wearing Apple Watches just look like adult Spy Kids, which the Apple Watch community has actually seemed to embrace. Transformers Revenge of the Fallen predicts Shia LaBeouf's mental decline. This is referring to the fact that in Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, Sam Witwicky interacts with a sliver of the Allspark. His human brain can't handle the overload of ancient data, causing him to seemingly begin going insane and mentally breaking down. I guess this implies an ominous foreshadowing of the real-life mental breakdowns of the actor. Doctor Who predicted AirPods. In the Doctor Who episode Rise of the Cybermen, we first see the Cybus earpods. These are worn by almost everyone in an alternate timeline as they were extremely useful high-tech devices. However, they were of course used as mind control devices with the intent to eventually turn everyone into Cybermen. Many have pointed out the similarities, mostly in name, to Apple's AirPods. Earpods, AirPods. Get it? Well, maybe if enough people start wearing AirPods, Apple will take control of the majority of the population and turn us into MacBooks or something. Okay, on to Tier 5. Starting with Mercenaries 2 predicted the Venezuelan government seizing American oil rigs. Mercenary 2 World in Flames is set in Venezuela and released in 2008. The game was pretty controversial upon release because of its portrayal of Venezuela as well as the country's president at the time, Hugo Chavez, who actually remarked upon the game himself. He accused the game of being propaganda aimed at legitimizing a potential invasion of Venezuela by the United States. The reaction was rooted in the game's narrative, where the fictional Venezuelan president attempts to take control of an American oil platform, mirroring real-world tensions over oil resources. The game, however, went a step further in its fictional narrative, suggesting a scenario in 2010 where the Venezuelan government would seize US-owned drilling rigs without any compensation, and it turned out to actually happen. So maybe Chavez was just mad that a video game seemed to know his plans. Grab the Child, Benny Child to Collect predicted the worst groomer on the internet. This really sent me down a weird rabbit hole and requires a little bit of backstory, but basically there's a Roblox creator named Ma Bucket who created several Roblox worlds, including one titled Grab the Child, Mini Child to Collect, where you literally collect and trade children like they were collectibles or something, which is really weird. But it gets way weirder because apparently this guy has multiple online identities, most notably the handle Cheesecake, which he's used to make not safe for work furry art online, and this is where he got busted because several Discord chats leaked of him chatting with minors, and these chat logs are horrifying. He gets into some really gross stuff and even admits to doing things to his real-life kid sister, so it's a big bowl of awful. And if you want to look more into details on this, there's a great deep dive video by a YouTuber named Jax. I have to say, this one is strange because it's less that the game is a prediction, but rather a self-fulfilling prophecy by a sicko. Prince predicts 9/11. So there's a strange recording of a Prince concert from 1998 in the Netherlands where Prince performed an extra long show and he just starts jamming out with the band at one point, seemingly making stuff up on the spot. Although the repeated line he continues to say is, Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb. He also says this right after mentioning heading back to America and get ready for the bomb. Then weirdly enough, he also says, get ready, 2001 is coming. Now, I could leave it there and let everyone bask in the spookiness, but I do have one note to add. The weirdest part of this to me is the 2001 part. Since the concert was in 98, why randomly say 2001? If anything, 2000, the new millennium, would have made more sense. Well, apparently Prince's band would commonly play Wagner's Also Sprach Zarathustra, which was later adapted for Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey. So Prince was likely mentioning the fact that they were about to play this song. The coincidence is still odd, but I just couldn't move on without that mention. I can also now say that I've spent a fair bit of time in the forums at prince.org, so that's fun. American Dad predicts Paul Walker's death. Kind of a loose connection here, but in an American Dad episode, Steve and his friends stumble upon a plane crash in the woods where they find that the Fast and the Furious scriptwriter has died in the crash with the unfinished Fast 7 script in his hands. This episode came out almost exactly 1 year before Paul Walker's infamous car crash, which occurred during the production of Fast 7. Rampage Universal Tour predicted 9/11. This is another one of those where it's not really a prediction, but rather just a game that happens to have the World Trade Center being destroyed. So Rampage is a great arcade game series where you play as giant monsters and the objective is to smash buildings to pieces, trying to inflict as much damage as possible. Well, in Rampage 2 Universal Tour, the monsters slowly work their way through different parts of the world. Naturally, one of the levels in the American section of the game is New York. In this level, you can actually climb on and destroy the 2 towers, reducing them to nothing but rubble. A sad sight, and the game only came out 2 years before the attack. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure predicts Alexander McQueen's death. So there's a character in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure named Thunder McQueen, who suffers from a personality disorder resulting from crippling depression and is suicidal. Strangely enough, the character is named after real-life fashion designer Alexander McQueen. 10 years after Thunder McQueen debuted, Alexander took his own life, apparently struggling with some of the same issues the character did. Pretty sad. Over the Hedge predicted Karens. This is referring to the main antagonist in the classic animated film Over the Hedge. She basically embodies every Karen stereotype, and some have called her the original Karen, as the film came out years before the use of the term Karen caught on in the wild. The truth of the matter is, Karens have always existed. We just never had a short, satisfying name for it. Amy Winehouse predicted her own death. Apparently, after Amy Winehouse's death in 2011, a magazine interviewed her closest friend, Alex Folden, who said, "Amy always told me she thought she would die young and that she knew she'd become a part of the 27 Club." Pretty spooky, but really it's more of a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, let's finish up with Tier 6. Starting with Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri predicted human genome mapping. Alpha Centauri was a twist on the familiar Sid Meier Civilization games. This time you control a civilization in the 22nd century and in a completely different galaxy. One of the scientific projects you can work on in the game is mapping the human genome. While this seemed to fit perfectly in a futuristic sci-fi setting, the human genome was actually fully mapped only 4 years later. Shadow the Hedgehog predicts pump-action rifle. Shadow the Hedgehog released in 2005 and featured some familiar Sonic-style action, but with guns. There's an infamous cutscene in the game where Shadow pumps his SMG to the amusement of the internet. Well, little did they know that 9 years later, an actual pump-action rifle, the Troy 223, would go into production. Jax Films predicts Chris Pratt voicing Garfield. There's a clip from an old Jax Films video where he makes an offhand joke that they should make Chris Pratt the voice of Garfield to fix the franchise.
Fuck it. Let's make Chris Pratt the new voice of Garfield. Would that fix it? I hope I never find out.
And Chris Pratt was in fact announced as a voice of Garfield. The Sixth Day predicting self-driving cars. The Sixth Day is a sci-fi action movie released in 2000, but set in the future. While there have been many other sci-fi movies with self-driving cars, such as I, Robot, the movie's representation of them looks the most like actual self-driving cars of today. I think because the movie doesn't have the clean future look that I, Robot has, for instance. Instead, it more closely resembles real cars on the road. Pretty neat. Angry Video Game Nerd predicts toilet paper crisis. This is just a gag, but it made me laugh. During the infamous toilet paper shortage during COVID, someone found this classic AVGN clip weirdly on point.
The only thing I can think of to use these things for is to wipe your ass with it. You might as well save that toilet paper. It's worth a whole lot more. X-Force predicted COVID and the social media impact. This one is very specific to JoJo fans, but basically in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, there are special abilities the characters use called stands. X-Force is a YouTuber, and in a particular video released in 2018, he was holding a stand contest, which is where fans can submit their ideas for stands. I hope that's all correct because I'm admittedly not a huge JoJo nut, but in this video, X-Force describes a stand called American Idiot, named after the Green Day song, in which the stand can inject false information into people's electronic devices, and the user who sees this information will automatically believe it to be true.
The stand can inject things into your timeline, and when you read it, you will believe it as absolute truth.
And goes on to list several examples, one of which is a virus outbreak.
Or there's like a virus outbreak in your country. Or
these two things combined definitely parallel the pandemic and the rise of combating information, making it hard for people to know what information they can trust online. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car predicting the end of World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria occurred on June 28, 1914. He and his wife were gunned down while traveling in an open-top automobile through the streets of Bosnia. This event is often considered the major catalyst that started World War I. Well, that's all fairly well known, but there's a much stranger detail about the whole thing. The car that Ferdinand was shot in had an interesting license plate number, A111118. If you break down the numbers here, it can be read as 11/11/18 or November 11th, 1918, the day World War I ended. And you can even take it a step further and look at the A as standing for armistice, which is the agreement made ending the conflict. Pretty weird little nugget of history. Black Mirror predicted the British Prime Minister having sex with a pig. I actually thought this was a joke, but boy was I wrong. So everyone knows the pilot episode of Black Mirror where a member of the royal family is kidnapped and will only be released if the Prime Minister has intercourse with a pig live on camera. This episode originally ran in 2011, and it was only 4 years later that the infamous Piggate scandal came out. I say infamous, but honestly I didn't know anything about this till now. Anyway, the scandal came about when, in an unauthorized biography of David Cameron, the then British Prime Minister may have inserted his penis and or into a dead pig's mouth as part of an initiation ceremony for the Piers Gravestone Society at Oxford University. This was denied, of course, but you can't help but see the similarities, and it's hilarious and a little disturbing. And finally, Radiohead predicts Ice Age movie. This is referring to the Radiohead song Idiotech, or more specifically the lyrics Ice Age coming, Ice Age coming. Ice Age coming, Ice Age coming. This is clear and undeniable evidence that Radiohead somehow knew that in 2 years the critically acclaimed box office hit Ice Age would be hitting theaters. Wow, I'm kind of blown away.